How Brussels learned to delay. It was not hesitation born of fear. It was delay refined into a method. In Brussels, waiting became a tool as powerful as acting and far more discreet. To understand how delay became strategy, we need to look at how Europe learned from its own fractures. Early crises exposed the danger of moving too fast without unity. A single announcement could split markets. A premature decision could harden political lines. Over time, speed came to be seen not as strength, but as risk. That lesson still shapes European decision-making today. The story begins with institutions built to balance, not command. Power in Brussels is distributed across mandates, councils, and legal boundaries. Every move requires alignment. In moments of stress, that structure slows response. At first, this was seen as a flaw. Markets moved faster than consensus. Confidence suffered. But something changed. Policymakers noticed that delay altered behavior. When decisions were not immediate, markets adjusted expectations downward. Speculation slowed. Pressure diffused across time, rather than concentrating in a single moment. Waiting began to absorb shock. Gradually, delay became deliberate. Announcements were prepared, then postponed. Tools were discussed, then held in reserve. Silence was used not to hide weakness, but to test whether stress will resolve itself without intervention. Often it did. Inside Brussels, this approach was framed as prudence. Acting too soon risked exhausting credibility. Acting too late risked irrelevance. Delay offered a middle path. It preserved optionality while avoiding commitment. The system learned to watch before moving. Markets learned as well. Absence of action no longer implied paralysis. It implied assessment. Participants adjusted behavior accordingly, slowing their own responses in anticipation of eventual coordination. Delay reshaped tempo across the system. What emerged was a new kind of influence. Brussels no longer needed to lead every move. By controlling timing, it shaped outcomes indirectly. Pressure eased not because decisions were announced, but because the possibility of decision remained credible. How Brussels learned to delay was not a story of inaction. It was a story of timing turned into policy. And once mastered, delay became one of Europe's most misunderstood sources of power. The effectiveness of delay depended on credibility built earlier. Markets had to believe that action would come if needed. Without that belief, waiting would look like weakness. Brussels understood this balance intuitively. Delay worked only when it was paired with visible capacity. Institutions reinforced that credibility quietly. Legal frameworks were strengthened. Emergency tools were designed and rehearsed without being used. Coordination channels were tested in simulation rather than in crisis. The system prepared in advance, so it could afford to wait in public. Inside policy circles, delay became a filter. Not every disturbance deserved response. Some pressures faded once speculation cooled. Others revealed themselves as structural. Waiting separated noise from signal. When action finally came, it was more targeted and harder to challenge. Markets adapted to this rhythm. Traders learned not to front-run announcements that might never arrive. Volatility softened as expectations adjusted. Time itself became a stabilizer. By stretching reaction windows, Brussels reduced the chance of cascading moves driven by anticipation alone. National governments also adjusted behavior. Knowing Brussels would not move instantly, they prepared domestically rather than appealing immediately for collective action. That preparation often resolved issues locally, reducing the need for broader intervention. Delay redistributed responsibility. Critics argued the approach was dangerous. That waiting risked allowing stress to deepen. Sometimes they were right. Delay is not neutral. It shifts cost from speed to patience. When misjudged, it can amplify damage rather than absorb it. But Brussels refined the method through experience. Delay was shortened when coordination risk rose. It was extended when fragmentation threatened. Timing became adaptive rather than fixed. The system learned to read the market's breathing. What emerged was a subtle form of governance. Power exercised not through command, but through restraint. Influence applied by shaping when decisions occurred, not just what they were. Brussels had learned that in a union without full political unity, timing could substitute for authority. Delay became the space where alignment formed or failed, and that space would soon be tested in ways no model could fully predict. The method was tested when delay no longer diffused pressure, but concentrated it. A period of overlapping stress demanded clarity. Markets were no longer waiting calmly. They were repositioning defensively. The risk was not panic. It was fragmentation. Inside Brussels, the signals were unmistakable. National responses began diverging. Funding costs separated along political lines. The window for observation narrowed rapidly. Delay, once stabilizing, was becoming a liability. The shift forced recalibration. Decision-makers shortened timelines. Preparatory work moved to execution. What had been held in reserve was brought forward with intent. The system moved not because delay failed, but because it had reached its limit. When action arrived, it arrived with force. Measures were announced decisively. Coordination was emphasized publicly. Markets reacted immediately, not with relief, but with alignment. Volatility subsided. Fragmentation eased. The delayed response proved effective precisely because it was not incremental. What mattered was contrast. The sudden clarity after prolonged observation carried weight. It signaled that waiting had been choice, not inability. That distinction restored confidence quickly. The episode revealed the boundary of delay. It works when uncertainty is shared. It fails when divergence accelerates. Knowing when to stop waiting became as important as knowing how to wait. Brussels absorbed the lesson. Delay is a tool, not a doctrine. It must be reversible. It must be paired with readiness to act decisively when alignment frays. Without that readiness, restraint turns into risk. The system survived not because it always waited, but because it knew when waiting was no longer stabilizing. That balance between patience and decisiveness would define Europe's next chapter of governance. The aftermath reshaped how Brussels understood its own influence. Delay was no longer seen as caution alone. It was recognized as a signal, one that markets interpreted constantly. Silence could calm or unsettle, depending on context. Timing had become a language. Institutions refined the approach. Triggers for action were clarified internally, even if they remained opaque publicly. Delay was structured, not improvised. Observation periods were bounded. When thresholds were approached, preparation shifted automatically into execution. Markets adjusted in parallel. Participants learned to read not just announcements, but pacing. The absence of action was weighed against past behavior. Credibility depended on consistency. Delay worked when it followed a recognizable pattern. When it didn't, trust eroded quickly. National governments also learned to navigate the rhythm. They no longer assumed immediate collective response. They planned for interim periods of uncertainty. That planning reduced dependency and strengthened resilience across the Union. What Brussels ultimately learned was restraint with intent. Waiting was powerful only when it preserved choice. Acting was effective only when it followed restraint. The two had to exist together, not in opposition. The method did not eliminate crises. It reshaped how they unfolded. Instead of sharp breaks, Europe experienced slower adjustments. Instead of sudden fragmentation, it saw negotiated realignment. The cost was time. The benefit was cohesion. How Brussels learned to delay became a blueprint for governance in a system without singular authority. Not perfect, not risk-free, but adaptive. Because in a union built on consensus, power often lies not in the first move, but in knowing exactly when to make the next one. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.